All right. I am joined once again by Matt McManus and Conrad Hamilton, who are, among many other things, are the co-authors of a recent Jacobin piece called In Defense of Slavoj Žižek, which I would urge everybody to check out. We are finishing up tonight our breakdown of the Žižek-Hannan debate. So for anybody who missed part one, the link to that is in the description. But I think it's okay. I don't think it's like, watching the Marvel movies where if it's out of order, you'll like some of the plot twists won't be as meaningful to you or anything like that. I think you should be able to just come right in here. But I think since we are going to make an effort to get right into it, I should also say Matt is the author of a review that just came out today in historicalmaterialism.org is where you can find this, of Žižek's book, Sex of the Failed Absolute is the name of the book. The name of the review is Absolute Sex, the Problems of Political Economy.
I decided on that one because I was like, it's kind of just boring just saying a review of, absolute sex. We'll draw them in, right?
That is a truly phenomenal title, Matt. I applaud it.
Thank you.
So should check that out. But we are going to make a real effort here to get through the rest of the debate in 2 hours. So with that in mind, let's get right to it. We just finished the opening statements.
We now move towards 5 minutes of rebuttals each. Over to you, Slavoj.
It's me. First. Okay. First, there are many things. It may surprise you that I more or less agree there. I never believed in that stuff of, it's a good idea, but it's not real socialism. That fits the idea. And I even wrote an analysis of how Western intellectuals who were comfortably living in revolutions always liked another example, like another country where there is authentic revolution. It was Cuba, then it was whatever, and so on. But what surprised me is that this, not my first line of not defense, but kind of a counter argument, is that this idea of look at the reality of an idea, how an idea is actualized. If there is a Marxist point, this is it. An authentic Marxist even would never have said that. Now, let's go on. First, about predictions of future. I cannot restrain saying this. But in many empirical predictions, for example, Engels, who is considered minor guy, were surprisingly ingenious. You know that Engels in 1880s predicted not only the First World War, with even approximating the number of deaths. He said 10 million and so on, but he even then in one letter predicted that if Germany loses, a decade or two later, there will be another world war and so on and so on. But let me go to a more serious topic. Yes, I agree. I don't play this game that some Marxists look at this, how should I call it, point when things make the wrong turn. First it was Stalin, then it's already Lenin or where. No, there was something which I would locate in Marxist theory of social dynamic, immediate democracy, and so on, which obviously had this potential. But I would just draw attention to one detail. Nonetheless, there is something in Marxism that you don't find in fascism or right-wing authoritarianism. You had dissidents from the very beginning, people who strongly opposed it. They are not clean themselves. I'm not saying Trotsky was more Democrat and so on, but the gap, this gap was not just a gap between pure idea and its result, but it was a horror experience which broke down and so on. You had people who claimed what Stalin is doing is horrible, communist. You never had people who claim Hitler is not a true fascist. The problem I have with Solzhenitsyn is that when he tries to locate the causes, he basically locates them, if I remember it correctly, into the withdrawal of Christianity, modern secular society, and so on and so on. I oppose this. I think, if anything, Stalinist communism is precisely a perverted return of a religious structure. But so I don't have any problems with this. My problem is just this one. How, yes, we should locate the causes in Marx himself. I'm a Hegelian, I see that. But today, I think that liberal market economy is approaching a problem with ecology, with a pandemic and so on. And for me, the challenge is precisely how to do this, a kind of a social organization of economy is the only way that we know the Chinese way. Because the danger I see today is not a return of the old communism, but it's a new figure of, should I call it, authoritarian capitalism. It's difficult. I don't know how to define China today. For some liberal capitalists, they say it's not even capitalism. But something is emerging there, and I fear this communists still in power who play effectively with capitalism is even more dangerous. And here I still believe that Marx can, that would be my paradox, probably most of you will disagree, that Marx offers us good analytic resources in his critique of ideology and so on, to not only criticize what came after him, but to look for the sources of these troubles in Marx himself. That would be my position. Did I use my 5 minutes?
Perfectly. Yes. Over to you, Daniel, for your 5-minute rebuttal.
Thank you, Mr. President. The bayonet is an essential necessity for introducing communism, said the Comintern Secretary Karl Radek, who then appropriately was killed in a labor camp in one of the purges. It was always intrinsic. When Slavoj says, well, Trotsky was a dissident, you didn't really get sort of anti-fascist dissidents. Do you know what? I think that there is a parallel universe somewhere where Trotsky took power in the USSR, inflicted the same horrors and privations and miseries on that people that they experienced under Stalin. And in that parallel universe, the young, trendy Western communists have turned Stalin into their kind of Goldstein snowball figure. That's the lost prince. It could have all been so different had we only had different personnel, had we only had, socialism in one country rather than attempted global revolution or whatever their excuse would have been. It never works. It is intrinsic. Now, I want to come back to this point about Marx being a failure as an economist on the most basic level. We didn't actually hear much of a defense of him in this regard from Slavoj, but it is one that one hears a lot, including from Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell, both of whom have said they very much respect Marx as a great economist. Really? You respect Marx as a great economist? I mean, you know what? That's kind of like saying that you respect Nero as a great musician, or that you respect Osama bin Laden as a great theologian, or that you respect Hitler as a great strategist. Even if it were true, it would be a really bizarre thing to say. But it's not true. They were all hopeless at those things, and Marx was an utterly hopeless economist. He couldn't understand that wealth was not finite. But let me read you the most basic. I don't think you need to have any economics to see what's wrong with this. This is what he says in Capital. The sum of values in circulation clearly cannot be augmented by any change in their distribution, any more than the quantity of precious metals in a country can be augmented by a Jew selling a Queen Anne's farthing for a guinea. Oh yeah, That's another thing that we're all supposed to overlook. The anti-Semitism. I mean, sure, he had a downer on all religions, right? But this grandson of two rabbis had a particular loathing for Judaism and expressed it in vicious and sometimes biological semi-pornographic language, which would now have anyone else cancelled by our modern sensibilities. You come back to trying to impose bad ideas with force, you do need those bayonets. And I think I'm right in saying that even Slavoj, albeit slightly indirectly, has nodded in that direction. I remember an essay of his in which he wrote about the revolutionary terror, and he contrasted the humanist terror, as he put it, of the Directorate in France with the inhuman terror of rightist dictatorships. This is the line that struck me. Utopian explosions of political imagination in a way redeemed the virtual content of terror from its actualization. Now, that's a very elegant way of saying the ends justify the means. They meant well. The idea was a good one. I can't see how it was any better from the point of view of the victims. Final point. The idea of Marxism as a solution to our environmental problems. Ladies and gentlemen, Marx taught that nature was a resource to be exploited, a doctrine that found brutal realization in the smokestack industries of the Comecon states. Marxism turned Lake Aral into a desert and turned the Volga into a sewer and created so much oil and gas pollution on Lake Baikal that you were told that you couldn't throw a lighted cigarette overboard. The reality is that the best thing that happened to the environment was the fall of the Berlin Wall, which reintroduced the concept of ownership, the idea that people would be in charge of something so that they would have an incentive to look after it. It really won't do to list these various desiderata and say, I'm in favor of anti-discrimination or environmental protection or poor people getting richer, and I'm also in favor of Marx, and therefore let's bundle them all together. You know what has made poor people richer? The same thing that has made the environment cleaner, and that is the extraordinary growth in global GDP and the rise in longevity, literacy, the fall in infant mortality, the rise in female education, all the rest of it brought about by you-know-what, free markets and the integration of previously socialist societies into a global trading system.
Thank you, Dan.
All right. Certainly have some thoughts about this, but let's start with you guys. Conrad? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I just want to say that I agree with Slavoj, first of all, about I think the ease of sort of disavowing all socialism that's socialism ostensibly that's transpired and simply declaring it inauthentic in relation to the vision of Marx. And I think one thing in particular where this creates problems is that it prevents us from identifying some of the issues in the work of Marx, which potentially engender difficulties when it's implemented on a political level. So, and I am a Marxist, so of course I don't approach this from the same angle as, someone like Hannan, certainly. But I do think that, in a way, if you look at the, Marx's critique of Proudhon and his critique of, leftists who attempted in some sense to democratize the market in order to create a better society, it was based on this vision, which really derives kind of from Ricardian socialism and Owen, of the idea of, the central management of production, albeit a sort of democratically managed central ownership of production. And I think that one of the difficulties this creates is, Marx didn't necessarily elaborate, how, workers sort of combining their efforts, engaging in the management of production would be able to do so in a way that's democratic. So often that sort of appears as a kind of, deus ex machina, the expropriators are expropriated, the workers take over, and so forth. And I think that, it's very interesting actually about Stalin, who's discussed here. the Marxist, the computer scientist and economist Paul Cockshott, he's advanced, I think, an interesting view of Stalin, and he said, well, in a way, while it's often said that Stalin is not socialist, Stalin is not, as is commonly alleged, so much a state capitalist, because if you look at the money that workers furnish the state, right, when they're working in public enterprises, it's obviously, and Ben, you've said this yourself, like, the Soviet Union, their opera chicks were like mosquitoes compared to Jeff Bezos' Dracula, right? It wasn't like a really large amount. As Cockshott points out, in every economic system, there has to be surplus labor that's sort of kicked up, right? In order for a central apparatus to kind of function, right? That's not tantamount to this relentless, kind of capitalist exploitation. But as Cockshott points out, even if that's the case, right? In the Soviet Union under Stalin, there was a total deficit, of any kind of cooperative management or democratic input, right? So in practice, the way that while in many respects the system there was a continuity economically with what Marx proposed, what there was an absence of, what were any of the sort of democratic means of control that Marx supported, right? So I think again, if we just, it's very easy to just disavow those things, but I think too easy, really. Obviously the thing about saying that if Trotsky had just taken power, everything would be okay. I don't know how that suffices for historically materialist analysis. I mean, I think I've remarked before that every sort of communist dictatorship which emerged was also non-democratic prior, right, to its revolution having transpired. So I think you really have to look at the thread of history and how it unfurls, rather than attributing these things solely to individuals. And it's funny actually, because Hannan, in his rebuttal, he said, well, I imagine an alternate universe where Trotsky had taken power and done these horrible things, and there's sort of campus leftists saying, well, if only Stalin had been the guy. It's interesting because that actually resembles in certain respects things which Žižek has said, right? Žižek has said, well, Trotsky was a very violent guy, and I'm against this sort of idolization of, so there's a weird sort of parallel emerging there too, right? I'll just say two final things before I go on. First of all, I'm not totally satisfied with Žižek's analysis when he says that China is sort of state capitalist. I think this was perhaps more adequate to the China of Deng, or sort of the China of the mid to late 90s or early 2000s. The role of publicly owned enterprises, for example, has increased considerably since then. And there are signs of discontent with the onward sort of march to capitalism that was characteristic of that period. So I'll just leave it at that. But finally, I want to say about Marx and anti-Semitism. Sometimes these claims come up, but I think that they are, it's unfair, I think, to say that Marx was just an anti-Semite. If you look at one of his first essays, right, on the Jewish question, he's criticizing the anti-Semitism that was found within some of the young Hegelians, including Bruno Bauer, right? And what he's showing is that it's the economic structure of society, which instills people with these sort of tendencies and behaviors, and that for society to or to exactly say this, but for religion to be abolished, right, and the sort of sectarianism it's characterized by, would actually require there to be a sort of refoundation of morality at the level of the state, right? So as long as you have the marketplace, in its sort of the way that it functions in this kind of unjust and indiscriminate way, there will always be religion there to function as a kind of safety valve, right? So it's only in engaging in a kind of moral refoundation of society, right, and actually annulling these unjust operations of the marketplace, that religion will become redundant. So, a lot of the gestures that Marx uses in Capital are essentially poetic, but he's often misunderstood in this point. For example, I think often people point to a letter Marx wrote about LaSalle, in which he says that LaSalle was a Jewish N-word or something to this effect. But if you examine the context of this a bit more closely, Marx had a discussion with LaSalle, and LaSalle was claiming that the Jews were ethnically related to the ancient Greeks, right, in this discussion with Marx. And Marx, it's this sort of keep it real moment, right, where Marx, who was also of Jewish descent, was making fun of LaSalle for feeling that he had to justify himself, right, as someone Jewish by claiming, oh, we're connected to this, tradition of European antiquity, right? So this is the sort of context that people tend to miss, right, when they make these kind of allegations. So that's all I'm going to say there.
Fair enough. Matt?
Yeah, well, I want to say I think that most of Hannan's comments were ridiculous. If he wants to criticize the Soviet Union and Soviet policies, or Chinese policies for that matter, I'll be right there cheering him on. But what this has to do with the virtues and defects of Marxist economics, let alone the kind of position that Žižek's taking, I have no idea, right? So I'm just going to make a couple quotes really quickly about why I think that we should respect Marx as an economist. And then I'll put the kind of comments I want to make about Žižek to the side, because I'm sure it'll come up later, right? So it's really important to understand Marx's relationship to the tradition of 18th and 19th century political economy, of which he was a very prominent member, right? Because a lot of the virtues of his approach to economics stems from the kind of insights that were developed, ironically enough, by people like Adam Smith and Ricardo. And the limitations of his thought on economic matters are also very much derived from this kind of tradition, particularly this emphasis on labor as the source of value in an exchange economy. So when it comes to like the kind of things that Marx did as an economist that I think are really valuable, I'll just name three of them, right? First off, I think it's remarkable that in the 19th century, he was one of the first people to predict that capitalism not only was going to produce standards of living and more goods than ever before, but it was also going to be a global system, such as we had never seen before. And Sheldon Wolin makes this point very nicely in his essay collection on Marx, where he points out that Marx was in many ways the first theorist since antiquity to actually think about geopolitics in global terms rather than in terms of the nation state, because he was aware of what the capitalist system was doing and how revolutionary it was in this respect, in a fashion that most bourgeois economists just hinted at. Right. The second respect, I think, in which he was a really interesting economist is in his account of money as a kind of medium of exchange, which establishes equivalencies that the kind of subjective theory of utility put forward by people like Bentham or James Mill, right, simply couldn't do. I think that's a really interesting theoretical innovation, right? And lastly, one of the things that I think that he's really insightful for, that even right-wing economists have given him credit for, more insightful right-wing economists, has been the way that capitalism is a revolutionary mode of production, which constantly compels capitalists to technologically innovate and thereby transforms the kind of society around us. So a couple of decades later, Joseph Schumpeter is going to write Capitalism, Socialism, Democracy, and actually try to take Marx head on by saying, yes, this is a process of creative destruction, but it's a beneficent process of creative destruction. We shouldn't look at it purely in terms of the destabilization of society that's produced, but we should look at it in terms of the new kinds of values that are created, and isn't this exciting and innovative, right? And none of this was really accounted for in Hannan's argument, right? In terms of the limitations of like Marx's economics, I think that there are plenty of them, right? Again, I think this fixation on value that you see at least in the first volume of Capital is problematic, right? And I've never really seen any Marxist who leans that, contemporary Marxist, I should say, that leans that heavily on the labor theory of value any longer. In fact, David Harvey in his Greed and Capital says we should not exactly sideline it, but not give it the kind of emphasis that opponents of Marxism do. And it's a limitation, but it's worth noting it's a limitation that's very much derived from the kind of concepts of 19th century political economy that Marx was responding to. Adam Smith had a labor theory of value. Ricardo directly said that all value comes from labor. And in some senses, what Marx is trying to do isn't to argue that labor is the source of value. I think that he's taking a more dialectical tact by saying that in the bourgeois era, we understand labor to be the source of value for a lot of complex reasons that wouldn't have been possible for somebody like Aristotle because he wasn't cognizant of the laboring that went into any kind of economic practice, right? The other respect in which I think Marxist economics, I say, is limited, is the kind of theory of capitalism's decline that's put forward at various points in Capital. But again, it's worth noting that this hardly was unique to Marx in the 19th century. Most bourgeois political economists in the early part of the 19th century all argued that there were limits to the kind of wealth that capitalism could create. This is why Thomas Carlyle, good conservative that he was, characterized economics as the gloomy science, right, or the dismal science. And, Adam Smith, Ricardo, Malthus, most prominently, all argued that capitalism had inherent limitations it would never be able to overcome. And eventually, when we ran up against the limitations of our economic growth, it would lead to immiseration, right? And it was extremely important for an economist to be able to account for that, which is exactly what Marxist theory does. So even on that kind of limitation that a lot of conservatives like to pick on him for, because they'll say, well, capitalism continued to thrive and prosper well into the 20th century, it's important to recognize that virtually any kind of major economic figure that conservatives will point to today as an exemplar from the 18th and 19th century would have held almost exactly the same opinion, albeit for very different reasons. So when it comes to Marx as an economist, I think he was a seminal figure, right? One we shouldn't be uncritical of, but somebody who there's still a great deal to learn from. Certainly, I think a lot more you could learn from him than picking up something like Malthus's book on population, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think that Marx, whatever else he was a incredibly close and careful reader of the sort of main bourgeois economists of his time and earlier, right? People like Smith and Ricardo. And in fact, as you say, a lot of the things he was wrong about were things that, mainstream bourgeois economics at the time was wrong about. Whether there are people who have sophisticated defenses of some version of the labor theory of value, I would say that, I agree with what Jerry Cohen says, we need to be really careful about like what the relationship is supposed to be between these things, which very oftentimes right-wing critics of Marx are not, right? They sort of pick up like, oh, here's an economic claim that's wrong, right? Like, so on most ways of reading, I think not all, but most ways of reading the labor theory of value, which, as Cohen points out, lots of Marxists think is just obvious, but that's because what they have in mind isn't really the like very technical thing that Marx was talking about, but some
that's for sure. Yeah.
Like rougher intuitive thing, that like, oh, labor is the source of all value in the sense that like, workers make products and capitalists typically don't, or at least they don't necessarily, not in the same way. And so workers are a source of value in a way that capitalists aren't. That's roughly, I think, what most, like on a sort of folk Marxist level, that's what we're thinking of, whereas most interpretations of the labor theory of value, there are a couple different ways of getting to this conclusion, but say that like equilibrium prices are going to be a function of average socially necessary labor time, which lots of economists will tell you is wrong. Whether it is wrong or it's not, I think that the core of Cohen's point is that Marxist claims about exploitation, for example, don't actually like logically rely on that claim about equilibrium prices, that you can pry them apart, because if nothing else, workers are the ones who make products, and there is and so if some of the value of those products has been taken by capitalists, you can still run the exploitation claim without making any sort of claim about equilibrium prices and average socially necessary labor time. And it's also just like, whether you agree with that argument or not, there's something in general a little sloppy about like taking a figure from the 19th century saying, aha, here's an empirical thing that they got wrong or allegedly got wrong. Therefore, everything that was constructed around it is wrong. And you can tell that that's a flawed procedure because, you could say, oh, well, Darwin was wrong about how inheritance worked, because he didn't know about genetics. So therefore he must be wrong about natural selection, which obviously doesn't follow. Now that's not to say that Marx was right about the rest of those things. It's just that like, it would obviously be a silly logical leap from here's the empirical stuff he got wrong to all of his other views that were in some way linked to that are wrong or can't be reconstructed without it. I would say, real quick, got a super chat from comedian WW. Thank you for the super chat. Says, have any of you seen the video Stolen Anarchy by Twin Rabbit? I have not seen that. If not, I highly recommend it. Discusses how anarchism and communism were derived from indigenous North American culture, specifically the Iroquois nation. Yeah, I mean, certainly in Marx and Engels' case, I mean, some of their ideas about primitive communism were based on Morgan's stuff about Native Americans. So I don't think that's a claim that would have he would have had a problem with, depending on how you cash that out. But just real quickly on the rest of this, I mean, I think there's a correct core to Hannan's point, which is, or like Jordan Peterson or other people who I've seen they make the same point, that like obviously if your whole analysis of what was wrong with the Soviet Union is that the wrong individuals were in charge, then yeah, that's bad. I mean, that's a overly reductive way to look at history. I think individual agency, can matter. I mean, clearly it sometimes does, right? In some historical situations, if you think that's incompatible with materialism, so much the worse for materialism. But usually for big structural things, I think it's a mistake to focus too much on that. So fair enough as far as that goes. Whether we could just assume, I mean, it's a good line, but it's also just like an assertion that's not backed up. Like, sure, we could just say things, right? That like this assertion that in the world where the left opposition had beat the Stalinist center in the Soviet Union, it would have been exactly the same. I think that's, I think that's a little dubious. I think that I think that I'm not a Trotskyist, but I think the Trotskyists, like, typically their criticism of the Soviet Union is not that the people in charge weren't sufficiently virtuous. It's they have a much more structural critique of that, and that as far as what those factions were fighting about in the 1920s, it was about whether to sort of cool off on the world revolution attempts and sort of do pragmatic geopolitical things to try to preserve what existed in the Soviet Union and build socialism in one country, which ended up being pretty authoritarian because they were trying to do essentially the equivalent of primitive accumulation that was pretty brutal in the West too, but like much more quickly, that whole process of enclosure and all that stuff that then played out for like centuries in the UK, and like cram it into like a 5-year plan. And obviously that meant that whatever was left of the sort of workers' democracy that had existed in some very incomplete way in the early stages of the revolution went away. Now it's entirely, I think the better critique isn't that all of that exact same stuff would have happened if the left opposition had won. I think the better critique is probably that if the left opposition had won and gotten their way, the Soviet Union just wouldn't have lasted that long, because they would have been so focused on trying to spread the revolution or whatever, they wouldn't have been able to come up with any long-term, détente with capitalist powers, and they would have just been wiped out. That might be true. I mean, I don't actually know. I don't think anybody knows. But I do think the core of Žižek's point is absolutely right. Like that this is a huge disanalogy between Stalinism and fascism, obviously there's no Nazi version of the left opposition or Italian fascist version of the left opposition, nor could there be. That tells you something, I think, pretty deep about fascism. And it's also, it's just not like there's also no contrast that you can make between what was advocated by, the way you can make a contrast between what was between Marx's ideas and like Stalin's ideas, you can't really make a contrast like that with Hitler or Mussolini and like early fascist, theorists, because fascism is not a theoretical tradition. That's very much not the point of fascism. I think that, and when I say that, sometimes people think I'm saying that like fascist intellectuals don't exist and they want to tell me about Carl Schmitt or something. That's not the point. Yeah, fascist intellectuals exist, but fascism is not an intellectual tradition in the way that Marxism is. In fact, if anything, it's kind of the opposite of that, historically. And I just wanted to say too that I do. So I think that that's right. I mean, I think that there is I think you could draw some pretty big contrasts certainly between like Marx's talk of free associations of workers and, whatever else he advocated. And I think he was probably way too fuzzy about it. I mean, I agree with Conrad as far as that goes. I think that I was actually just rewatching to try to, assemble some clips for tomorrow's show. When I was on TMBS with Bhaskar Sankara, and Bhaskar had a good line about how like Trotskyists always say in this way that suggests that like this was a source of amazing theoretical insights, that when Lenin was on the train back to the Finland station, to come back to Russia, he was rereading Hegel. And, Bhaskar's line was that, he probably would have been a lot better off, if he was like reading like, something about military strategy or economics or, like something else that would be useful, to building this new state, rather than reading Hegel. But so I think that's, that's also a fair like limitation on saying like, oh, Stalinism is just this divergence from the true Marxist path, because, Marx was way too vague about this stuff. I think that's a totally fair criticism of Marx. I think his reluctance to, write recipes for the cookshops of the future, like he says in one of the introductions, Capital, is probably excessive. I think there's an idea in classical Marxism that all this stuff is just going to kind of work itself out in the process of history when workers take power. And I think at this point that part's been falsified. That said, right, I mean, he clearly was talking about some sort of radically democratic alternative to capitalism, and what existed in some of these societies was in some ways the opposite of that. I mean, that there are and I think this is particularly relevant with the ecological stuff. I don't think it's at all true that Marx was totally indifferent to ecological concerns. I think that there's a lot of writing out there now that's like pushing back against that understanding of Marx.
John Bellamy Foster, just as a recommendation, Marx's Ecology, Materialism and Nature is probably the best guide to these kind of questions.
Yeah, I mean, and as far
I
as
would recommend Jason Moore, Capitalism and the Web of Life. I'm on the Moore team against the Foster team. They have this debate, right? We don't have to get into that, but
okay, yeah, I probably can't get through this in 2 hours if we start up on that. But I think that I think as far as like, the environmental record of Stalinism was very bad, and I think environmental record of Dengism in some ways has been very bad, but like, I think one part of that has to do with the imperatives of that kind of primitive accumulation, or depending on who you ask, socialist primitive accumulation in what were basically pre-industrial societies. The environmental track record of like 18th century England was also pretty bad, and I think also it has to do with the lack of political democracy. I mean, that you could have. Like if you look at the comparison between West Germany and East Germany, that I think that, West Germany had a giant green movement that was able to have some impact on policy, environmental regulations, whereas there's no equivalent outlet for those concerns in East Germany. But like, hey, what we all want instead of capitalism is something that's more democratic. So there are more outlets, for those sorts of concerns. Oh, and the last point I did want to just make real quick is, that quote that he read from Capital. Now, assuming that he's quoting accurately, it's not a quote I recognized, but I'm not like, okay, other than the anti-Semitism thing at the end, I'm not quite sure what his objection is to that quote, because he was bringing it up, Hannan was bringing it up as if it was, oh my God, look at how ignorant Marx was of economics. But the quote, if I'm remembering it right, I mean, if either of you guys heard something different, let me know, because like it sounded like a pretty innocuous claim. And in fact, it sounded like exactly the kind of thing that like a conservative might say, right? Like that you can't add to the value produced by a society through redistribution, which is like, that's a conservative talking point. And it's also correct. I mean, obviously it's correct. Nobody denies. I think that it's correct.
What do they always say, right? The government can't spend its way to prosperity through taxation. That's the kind of Gingrich line, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, it's like, and yeah, there's like obviously conservative version of it's kind of dumb, but I mean, it's like the core point. It's like, yeah, sure. I mean, redistribution doesn't by itself add to the, I mean, maybe you have some like complicated Keynesian argument that's not true in some sense or whatever, but like certainly it's not something you'd expect Hannan to have a problem with, which made me wonder if he just picked it because it's a quote from Marx about economics that like ends with something that's a little anti-Semitic, so he can go after Marx for that. On which, yeah, I think Conrad's totally right. It's like on the Jewish questions, what people usually on the Jewish question, that line about LaSalle in the letter and like a couple other things are what people quote when they're stringing together quotes to make this case. And I think it's undeniable that that Marx and Engels were I think were I mean, as was incredibly common, were more influenced by sort of casual anti-Semitism in the society than I hope most people now are. There's definitely been some social progress there, but also like if you're going to say Marx was a anti-Semite, like I mean, read the thing, right? Like on the Jewish question, the point of that pamphlet is to push back against, Bruno Bauer for opposing Jewish emancipation. They're saying that it should be conditioned on Jews giving up their own religious, beliefs and practices. So that the first part of it at least is pushing back against that, right? I mean, politically, the point in context is in favor of granting equal civil, legal and civic rights to Jews, and then the second point is why mere legal equality is insufficient, and legal rights by themselves don't add up to just as much as people think they do. And there's some I think there are some controversies about how to read what he's saying in that last part about rights, and whether he's saying rights aren't important or just they're not sufficient if they're merely formal. But however you read all of that, and whether you completely agree with his point about that or not, he's clearly pro civil and legal equality for Jewish people. So if you think like it's really it's depressing. I mean, it's like at least, and I think it's like really the way that people quote mine this stuff. I mean, not that they didn't before the internet, but it's like I think it's gotten much worse because like it used to be that if you wanted to like find offensive sounding quotes from a book, you had to actually physically pick up the book and start through it. And on your way to finding the quotes you wanted, you might accidentally stumble on like the content of the book and get some idea of what the book was about. Now you can literally just search for keywords, Jew, and
just control F, baby. Got to do it.
And it all gets recycled from the conservative ecosystem also. But like one of the things I want to say that I thought was really insightful was the point you made about the centrality of democracy to Marx. And I think this is in part one of the reasons why conservative economists and conservative defenders of capitalism really don't like his thinking, because there's this inherent democratic quality to the kind of positions that he puts forward. And I think that you can see this in the way, first off, that he historicizes economic phenomena in a way that contemporary conservative economists typically don't, right? And then on the other, in the way that he argues how any attempt to dehistoricize economic phenomena invariably creates a kind of ideology, right? And you see people like Hannan do this, right? Where they say there are these laws of economics, we have to be beholden to them. They can't really be questioned, but need to be treated like idolatrous tropes, right? Where you submit to them or you rebel against them, but you rebel impotently against them. Marx's kind of point consistently was we have to recognize capitalism as just one stage in the evolution of humankind. It's the best stage so far, but just one of them. We also have to recognize that any argument that it's eternal or that its laws of motion are actually eternal and static is invariably going to give rise to fetishized ways of thinking about things, right? And once you kind of make these arguments, the democratic aspect to it is, of course, you can now contest what's held up to be eternal, timeless, and changeless by saying, well, hold on, we could actually change it, and maybe we want to change it for the better, right? To establish a more egalitarian, more just, more democratic world, right? And so in this respect, the kind of radical core of Marxist thinking, I don't think has a great deal to do with some of the specific technical arguments he makes in Capital about labor, for example. It has a lot to do with the kind of space he opens for us to reconceptualize the possibilities of human social life. And that's why conservatives are always going to come after him. And that's why I think somebody like Žižek does a really good job of updating a lot of what's valuable in Marx for the 21st century, albeit not without problems. Right.
I just want to say, I want to add quickly before we wrap up on. I feel that it's common, of course, to cite the contrast of Marx's vision with that of those who would seek to sort of render kind of trans-historical, right, the basic structures of capitalist economy, on the right, for example, or neoliberals and so forth. But I think also, one of the really, really important values of Marx's work, and it's important to understand this, is the way that he was also, and maybe centrally in terms of whom the polemical targets are of works like Capital, pushing back against other people on the left, right? And the way that in their own way, right, even though they designated themselves as opponents of capitalism, they were also complicit, in the trans-historicization of its axioms, right? So if you look at William Clare Roberts in his book Marx's Inferno, he reads Capital primarily as an attack against Proudhon, right? Who was, sort of the biggest leftist thinker, even bigger than Marx in that time, who was associated or had engaged with political economy. And
also,
I think
also, by the way, much more anti-Semitic than Marx. But go on.
Yeah, of course, yeah. And I think one of the interesting things about this is that there's still a real vitality to this critique, because if you look at what Proudhon was sort of proposing, and I'm not going to get into elaborating like the nuances of like the Banque du Peuple, if anyone can, right, because it's not entirely coherent, right, these sort of proposals, right, it was essentially the idea that there would be a system established of sort of cooperative banking in which people would exchange goods, but they would exchange goods at their value, right? There'd be a kind of exchange of equivalence, right? And against this, what Marx attempts to show in Capital is the way that, the logic, right, of the market, of the value form, right, when taken to its apotheosis, leads to this perverse situation, in which labor power is commodified and in which people are separated, right, from the means of their immediate production, right? And so what looks like, or what can be ideologically presented, right, is this sort of, democratizing economic structure. You create goods, you exchange them, right, with your, the goods reflect the value of your own labor. In fact, transforms into something quite different, right, that's aggressively exploitative. Now, I think this is very important today because if we look at, sort of the ideology that undergirds something like crypto, right, if you look at this idea that, we're just going to have, everyone's going to be signing these smart contracts, right? And they're going to be able to bypass, these applications like Uber and just exchange goods between each other. And this is going to enrich, the working class. This sort of utopic vision, notwithstanding all the other problems with something like crypto, like the way that facilitates tax evasion and all that. What it misses is Marx's point that in a marketplace, capitalists who exploit labor, right, are always going to be more successful, right, than people who are, so to speak, selling goods, quote, at their value, right? Because of course they'll be able to offer things, potentially at a lower price, right, than their competitors, right? So in any kind of free market space, right, they acquire the resources, right, they build up capital, and they oust their competitors. So again, I think, beyond just what Matt was pointing out, right, which I think is very true, about the need to affirm the validity of Marx's writings, against those who would trans-historicize, the structures of present-day capitalism. I think we also need to look at the way that those same tendencies are manifested more discreetly within the left very often. I think the fetishization of, positive freedom at the expense of a sort of analytic of negative freedom is also a part of that more generally.
Yeah. I actually just want to follow up with one thing and say that I actually think the problem has become worse in some respects when it comes to bourgeois political economy. Really good book about this is Quinn Slobodian's The End of Empire and the Birth of Neoliberalism, where he gives this fascinating analysis of Hayek's writing, right? Hayek being arguably, I think actually inarguably, the most intelligent, most comprehensive, most systematic of the neoliberal thinkers. But one of the points that he makes is that what's odd in Hayek's thinking is he moves from a kind of mature Enlightenment standpoint, which is that we can understand the object of political economy reasonably well. We can do so through empirical analysis. And he transitions to regarding the economy as a kind of sublime object, right? Which we're able to infer certain tendencies if we're intelligent from, but we can never actually know in its totality, or even begin to know in its totality. But nonetheless, we should be subservient to its imperatives, right? And the difficult thing with this kind of argument is how do you actually confront it, right? If we cannot know the object that we're talking about because it's sublimated to this kind of level, then naturally we can't deliberate about its operations, right? And I think this is actually a really good point that Slobodian's making, because he points out that the way that conservatives have kind of weaponized this in their arsenal against Marxism and against socialism is to consistently say that we can't know enough about economics, ironically, in order to try to improve the conditions within which we live. Ergo, we just have to submit ourselves to this particular form of life without fundamentally questioning it or contesting it, which obviously has a very undemocratic quality to it. And in this respect, actually, I think it's really important to emphasize the Enlightenment basis of a kind of democratic critique of the market, where we say that one of the things that needs to be open to contestation in a genuinely democratic society is whether we actually want to live in a capitalist economy or we want to live in one that's a lot more egalitarian, fair, and actually gives everyone, what they need in order to lead a life of flourishing, right? And I think that this is actually one of the most obnoxious features of contemporary bourgeois political economy, which is precisely the idea that we're frankly too dumb to ever understand the economy, and so we should just submit ourselves to its imperatives without ever asking ourselves if we could do better. And I think we can. Yeah.
Well, that was very well said. Joshua, thank you for the super sticker. Brendan, thank you for the super chat. This is a deep cut. Just to Jesse Lee Peterson demanding that I tell him where logic comes from. I think the right answer is supposed to be God or something. I'm not sure, but
I'll never forget. I'm swear to God, I fucking nearly split myself when I watched that. It's been such a long time, but that was still to this day probably my favorite debate you've ever gone in. Oh yeah, sorry.
All right, now I'm glad I can provide some entertainment there. Would have probably been much less funny if I'd ever watched a show before, so I had some idea of what I was getting into. But yeah, let's watch some more.
I mean, that was bang on 5 minutes. And we now move towards a 15-minute conversational stage of the debate where each of our speakers can ask questions of the other. So if possible, we'll just alternate between who's the question, who's the answerer. And we can start this time with Daniel. If we could keep the questions relatively short and we'll go back and forward, that should hopefully allow for several questions each. Daniel, what would you like to ask?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll keep it very short. I wonder, Slavoj, if you could tell us which is your favorite example of a successful Marxist country? I think you're on mute.
Yeah, I now unmuted. Yes, please. Yes. Okay. I will give you, but can I then go a little bit longer? Yes, Bolivia. Isn't this an example where the government, Morales, Linera, and Lucho Arce, who is now the president, my God, do you know how much their real purchase power grew and so on and so on? And in a triumph of democracy, there was coup d'etat against them, and in the elections under, how should I put it, enemy's domination, they did it triumphantly. They are, for me, okay, I doubt if they will designate themselves Marxists and so on, but they show a pretty reasonable aspect of the left who, while retaining democratic legitimization, did it. As for Chavez, I don't have any sympathy for it. Just if I may reply just to your point very briefly about ecology and so on. You see, things are more complex here. I agree with you that there is this Marxist productivism and so on. But now I read some analysis of how, do you know, in the last 10, 15 years of his life, how obsessed Marx was with ecological topic. He read German analysis of soil, of circulation of matter, and he was so deep into the ecological topic. This was almost his main preoccupation. As for that alternate histories, I wonder if it's so simple. You know, Trotsky, I have no illusions about Trotsky. He became a critic afterwards, to put it brutally, when he lost power. But nonetheless, I debated with many historians this point. Let's say Stalin had a car accident and died in 22-23. I agree with you. It wouldn't be a thriving socialist democracy and so on and so on. I just prefer to keep it over. But my fundamental question to you, sorry, Joel, I didn't lose it, is, you know, I agree. I wrote that, I see incidentally that humanist terror. For me, I'm an old French theorist from the 70s. Humanism is a back term for me. By humanist terror, I mean, I refer to Maurice Merleau-Ponty's negatively justification of Stalin, that the future human society can retroactively justify today's. And would you agree, Daniel? My point is simply that it's not just that the how do you call it, goal aim justifies the means, that if there is a hidden premise of Stalinist Marxism, it's that means justify a goal. You know, you would imagine a goal so that you can comfortably terror now. But you know what's my sincere problem here? Do you really think, I'm sincerely becoming a pessimist here, do you really think that all these crises that we are obviously approaching, already the pandemic, I think there will be ecological crisis and so on and so on. I'm not saying, I agree with you, I was in Germany, I saw the tremendous poisonous lakes and so on. In Russia, it's even worse, but I'm just desperate here. Of course, it's not the 20th century communism. This was, as I wrote, the greatest politico-ethical fiasco and so on. But do you really think that market liberal economy can do it? No, I think it will have to be somehow regulated, limited. And for me, the big challenge is how to do it in a non-Chinese way. Because my big fear today is that, yes, immediately I will finish, that parts of the world at least are moving in the direction of this. I call it, although there are differences, they are not the same, Chinese Singapore model, which is, unfortunately, we have to admit also, and with Modi in India, economically quite successful now, my God. Is this the only way? I hope not. What do you think about this?
Thank you. So before I answer the question, I can't completely leave the point about Bolivia. I mean, let's treat it as a revolutionary socialist regime. We can quibble about fourth term. The Constitutional Court wouldn't let him. He had a referendum. He lost the referendum. He ignored the referendum result and went ahead anyway. So you always end up running up against the reality of people, if you like, not knowing what's good for them, all justified by this idea that we are acting on behalf of whatever new proletariat, I think you put it, the indigenous people or whatever, that they don't know their interests and we will act for them. And I think that is an incredibly dangerous, presumptuous, and ultimately destructive ideology. But to answer the question that you put to me, is the market capable of dealing with these global problems of a degraded environment and so on? I think we should be balanced about where there is good as well as bad news and why it's happening. My friend Matt Ridley, the science writer, has a nice phrase where he says, 50 years ago, wolves and tigers and lions were all endangered species. And what's happened since? Wolves have rebounded in huge numbers, tigers have flatlined, lions are still endangered. Why? Because wolves live in rich countries, tigers live in middle-income countries, lions live in poor countries. It is a very good thing, if you are an endangered species, to have enough wealth that there is not the pressure that there was on hunting, on using wood for cooking fires, on slash and burn agriculture, because the countries have moved beyond that. They get more money, if you like, encouraging people to shoot with cameras rather than with guns. You wouldn't think it looking at the coverage, but there has been a reforestation globally,
we just pause for this point in 1 second.
Since the 1980s of an area roughly the.
The odd thing is, actually, I've heard this argument before, and to me, it's one of the points that more directly conforms to Marx's kind of argumentative structure in Capital. Because one of the points that he makes is you're only going to be able to put political pressure on institutions to enact meaningful egalitarian reforms if there's a sufficiently developed material basis for the emergence of a kind of class-conscious, reflective proletariat, right? Now, that's putting it in 19th century terms, but the kind of argument that he's putting forward here very much conforms to this, right? Which is that once you have a certain level of material wealth that's achieved, people become more conscious of the kind of ways in which the market is actually interfering with things like the environment, and then they put pressure on state actors to impose limits on the market in order to preserve things like habitats for wolves or the environment, right? So I've never actually understood how it is that this is a point against Marxism, since it actually seems to actually affirm a lot of what he was saying about the need to have a sufficient level of development before you'll start to see these kinds of mass movements putting pressure on political actors to impose limitations on the market.
Yeah, I mean, I'd also say that, oftentimes when people like Hannan, Hannan, I think has really been a huge apologist for the history of British imperialism. And, when people like him talk about rich countries and poor countries, you sort of get the impression that it's just some sort of like natural phenomenon that like somehow or another, due to like sunspots or something, some countries ended up being rich and some countries ended up being poor, or maybe it has something to do with culture or whatever, rather than like, the difference between colonizing and colonized countries, perhaps being relevant here, right? I mean, like if you're Haiti, you had to pay reparations to France for the lost slave property until 1947. And if you're France, obviously you didn't have that albatross around your neck. But yeah, I mean, I think the idea that you're going to get better outcomes, like regulatory outcomes, whether environmentally or anything else, given a higher level of material development, I agree with you. That seems like an extremely Marxist point.
Yeah, it's also worth noting, to add to your point, that a recent University College London study found that indirectly European colonization killed 56 million people by the year 1600. Now, of course, some of this wasn't directly as a result of malice. It was a result of smallpox, famine, the destruction of entire civilizations and the kind of indirect effects that flow from that. But the reality is, of course, that these were conquerors who were in a place that they didn't belong in, and found different ways of justifying their malicious intentions by saying that they were doing it for God or for a country or whatever it happens to be. And had they not been there, those 56 million people likely wouldn't have died, and they would have passed on wealth to new generations, and who knows what would have happened, right?
Yeah.
So the kind of defense of imperialism that people like Hannan put forward, I think, isn't just bad faith. It's quite frankly kind of vile if you think about it.
As it relates to ecology, I would just add really quickly, it's ironic as well because, and Andreas Malm points this out in Fossil Capital, for example, the emissions crisis, as we know it, has its point of origin basically in the development of the steam engine and British industrialization, which is also, the basis of their imperial power, right? Particularly in the second wave of sort of global colonization of that period. So,
yeah, I mean, I think that. Oh, I was just going to say on the smallpox point, the smallpox isn't entirely separate from malice. That since you have, certainly in the Americas, there are points where it's essentially used as a, germ warfare by European settlers, and at the very least was widely celebrated, and there are tons of like old Puritan sermons you can find and stuff, that are super enthusiastic about the about like smallpox as an instrument of the will of God and clearing out the continent, for European settlement. But again, I mean, it's just like, yeah, I mean, clearly, whether you were in the position of producing raw materials for European factories, or whether you're in the position of taking those, like is going to have something to do with your later economic development. I mean, it's just weird and silly to pretend that it wouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, it's also worth noting, like in the Latin American context, since we're talking about Bolivia, right, that the Spanish conquistadors were particularly noteworthy for the kind of brutality with which they destroyed previously existing civilizations, some of which were highly sophisticated, if you think about the Mexica, right, and replacing it with a system of essentially neo-feudalism, which gradually transitioned to slave capitalism and all kinds of other nasty things, right? And essentially, many of the economies were actually actively devolved from being sophisticated kind of economic systems that produced high order goods into being mineral extraction economies whose sole purpose was to generate wealth for the mother country. And there's actually an interesting economic phenomena that flows from this, because for a long time, mercantilism was the dominant economic ideology in Europe, because the expectation was just flowing from the Spanish experience that if you extract enough mineral wealth from the ground, bring it to your country and produce a lot of gold, then that's going to make your country wealthy, because people didn't understand inflation and the kind of consequences that would flow from that, right? So not only were the Europeans actively devolving the economies of Latin America and introducing all kinds of horrible material relations that allowed them to exploit the people living there more effectively, but they didn't even actually gain that much from it, because they didn't understand that what they were doing wasn't actually going to make their countries wealthy, because just bringing in a lot of gold to your country is going to ultimately make you and the people of your country poor in the long run. So it was an evil enterprise backed by faulty logic and a pernicious understanding of economics. Right?
Yeah, and in the Spanish Inquisition, right, from you have late 15th century to the early 17th century, because of this, right, they decide, oh well, we have so much wealth, right, let's just go start liquidating all the Jews and the Moors, right, many of whom were engaged in industries that were actually productive, right, so the real economic base of these countries was actually removed in that time, right?
Yeah. Oh, and of course on Bolivia, really can't let that go by. Hannan said the thing about the referendum, which is true, that the Bolivian government before the coup did lose a referendum, and which was non-binding. They had the legal option of disregarding it, and they did, which is certainly criticizable on democratic grounds, but not nearly as much as the fact that they buy everybody's account now, right? Like the OAS has backtracked everybody. They won the election and were nevertheless deposed in a really violent military coup. That led to months of repression and human rights abuses in Bolivia. So I mean, this is this really is he's just like cherry picking. Is a phrase that was used in a recent debate in a funny way, but he is genuinely just like cherry picking the one aspect that he can look at to put the deposed Bolivian government, Evo Morales, in an undemocratic light, and ignoring all of the stuff around it that would suggest the opposite conclusion. So I mean, that's just not very intellectually honest. He would have been better off just sticking to the point that, okay, this is still ultimately, by global standards, a relatively mild social democratic government. This doesn't really answer my question about Marxism. And obviously I wouldn't have found that line of argument compelling, but it would have been a whole lot more honest and said, oh, look, Morales was some sort of, horrible, authoritarian because of disregarding the outcome of this referendum.
Yeah, because I mean, the only solution to a populist social democrat is a right-wing authoritarian regime. Will be better in virtually every respect, right? Just look at history.
But
size of Alaska. But that has happened very asymmetrically. The reforestation has been in Europe, in North America. It has been, if you like, offset by continuing deforestation in Brazil, Indonesia, and so on. Again, why? Because rich countries can afford a measure of biodiversity and environmental protection. I'm not saying that this solves everything. Of course, there are externalities. Of course, you have treaties and regulations. I'm not saying that there should be no role at all for regulating those things. But I would say that the best thing, if you are interested in living in a cleaner country with cleaner air, cleaner water, is to live in a rich country. I breathe cleaner air and drink cleaner water in London than I would in Lahore because I am living in a wealthier place. And if we want to clean up the air in Lahore, the best thing we can do is to integrate Pakistan into global markets so that the GDP per head rises there.
Maybe ask him if he approves high levels of migration to the UK in line with his thesis, right? It's like, well, just move everybody to a rich country then.
Well, oh, sorry, Ben, I don't want to cut you off.
No, I was going to say, notice that he never answered Žižek's question because what he was asked was, do you think the free market can solve this by himself? And he said, well, markets are going to make everybody more prosperous, and more prosperous countries have better environmental track records. But yeah, okay, but like, how exactly, what do you think happened in those more prosperous countries? Like, this isn't just something that arose or, like from there's no straight line from the prosperity to saving the wolves, without state action as an intermediary point. And if his only thing is, you're not realistically going to get the state action if you don't have prosperity, fine, right? But that has nothing to do with Žižek's question of, do you really think that unregulated, markets are going to do this?
What's also like with this thing about, and I just find it, bizarre, right? Like, if you want to have a better environment, just live in a rich country, right? It's like, okay, very, very great philosophy here. No, when he talks about the air being clean in London, right? It's like, the reason the air is cleaner in London than it would be in a poor country is because, production, industrial production has been shifted to poor countries, right? So if you look at a place like China, we know in Beijing, for example, the air is really horrific. There's many sort of infamous examples, but it's interesting, this is predominantly generated because of production for Western markets, right? And if you actually take out that production, China, for example, does not perform terribly, right? In ecological terms, right? So what, I guess like what he's saying is like, that if you remove the basic precondition for the production of wealth in the West, do you know what I mean? It's a totally bizarre point. Like,
I mean, Marx made a. Oh, sorry. I'll just make it quick. Marx had a very brilliant observation about this point, where he said that capitalism can never overcome its fundamental limitations. It can only export them, right? And when it comes to the ecological catastrophe, in some senses, people are literally exporting it to other countries. So if you think about trash, for example, most of the U.S.'s trash, or a growing amount of the U.S.'s trash, I should say, is actually being exported to countries like Indonesia, Vietnam. Once upon a time, it was China, literally because they don't have the infrastructure or the will to deal with it domestically any longer. So this is just a transparent example of exactly what Marx talking about, and how it is that just saying, well, why can't everybody just live like they do in a rich country, doesn't really understand the kind of global dynamic of capitalism and the sophisticated way even a tertiary reading of Capital would give to somebody like Hannan.
Yeah, I mean, if you're literally, like Conrad said, if you're just outsourcing dirtier industries to poorer countries, then markets will make poor countries rich. I mean, what's the, like, I mean, this is this kind of a little lady who swallowed the fly thing here, right? I mean, like I guess, like sometimes that does happen, right? I mean, South Korea has become a much more rich country, and lots of their production now happens, in other countries. If you walk around a grocery store and, a big department store in South Korea, you find tons of stuff that's made in Vietnam or whatnot. But that's clearly not a solution. And it's also just like, kind of like, yeah, sure. I mean, I'm sure every single person in Pakistan would say, yeah, that sounds good to me. I wish I lived in a, rich country. I mean, not that they would necessarily, immigrate, but I mean, like, it's like, yeah, I wish I lived in a richer in a richer country than I do, or at least that Pakistan was richer. But like, again, there are historical reasons why some countries are richer than others, and there's also the like inconvenient fact that that generally speaking, part of how a lot of countries in the European core got to be so rich, and even in rare examples like South Korea of things that were which was a developing nation and is kind of pole vaulted into the developed world, they were able to do that through protectionism to a great extent, right? I mean, it's certainly not that it's certainly not that free market policies, made England a rich country. I mean, very, very, very far from it, right? Like they were able to protect their own industries and pillage much of the rest of the world, and even in the Korean case, where you had even under like a right-wing military dictatorship, they ignored the advice of Western economic advisors. They thought we're not going to be a real country, if we don't produce our own cars, and had some protectionist measures in place. So the idea that Pakistan is going to become a rich country just by having totally unregulated markets is something that, if it happened, it would be the first time historically that's ever happened.
Yeah, and I just want to point out that Hannan's own country, just this year, it was reported by Greenpeace that 40% of UK plastic exports were sent to Turkey to be burnt and buried, right? So I don't think you should be preaching about why it is that the UK's environmental record and wealth are something that other countries should emulate, when what they're literally doing is exporting their trash to a different country so it can go up and smoke, and the people living there can deal with it. Right. That's just a kind of the staggering level of hypocrisy it takes to kind of hold to that kind of position would make somebody like Margaret Thatcher blush.
Sure. And I just want to add too, Ben, you're absolutely correct about, you and Thomas Piketty points this out actually in his writings, that the main factor that, permits, poor countries to develop in this way, and for the population to benefit, pertains to, not just domestic distribution of wealth, but also domestic control of capital. Right. Mm-hmm. So if you look at, if we look at the huge gulf separating Africa and China today, for example, 60% of manufacturing capital in Africa is owned by Europe and the United States. Right. Whereas if you look in China, it's a big part of the reason they, continue to apply this model of public ownership. Right. Only 29 of their 135 biggest companies are actually private. Right. The other ones are in government hands. Right. But, in a subtler way, we saw similar things with Japan and Germany. Even today, I think the Japanese government controls 49% of Toyota, right, which prevents them from simply offshoring jobs into poor markets and eliminating them in Japan, right? So it's public ownership absolutely central there.
Yeah, there is no, states, states shape economic outcomes. Like there are state policies that create economic development, and this idea that just like a hands off, just like let the invisible hand do whatever it wants is going to lead developing countries to join the developed world. Like that, it's certainly not what happened in Japan or Korea. It's certainly not what happened in the European core, the United States. It would be a totally unprecedented event. It would be, really that should be, that should be a Slavoj's response here, it's like, look, you keep challenging me to come up with a, successful Marxist country is kind of a weird combination of words anyway, because Marxism isn't the name of a system. It's the name of theory, but whatever. Like what he means, right? A successful, socialist government that's expropriated the entire economy or something like that. But you keep challenging me to come up with with one of those. By the way, depending on what your criteria for success is, I would say. And I probably do have some disagreements with Slavoj about this, based on one article I read by him, but I would say Cuba, right? It's a, there's certainly authoritarian aspects to the Cuban system I wouldn't defend, there are legitimate criticisms there, but I don't think there's the slightest doubt that the Cubans are better off as a result of the revolution. That that it's compared, like, I mean, I think that we can look at the we can compare Cuba to Haiti or even the Dominican Republic, and I think there are some like incredible successes there. I mean, if you're gonna so even if you are gonna do the thing that Hannan is doing, that I think is just kind of historically ignorant and weird, of like equating like Marx equals basically Marx equals capital C communism in the sense of like the Comecon countries for the 20th century. Even if you are going to play that game, which I think is stupid. I mean, like, you have countries whose ruling parties claim some inspiration from Marx, diverge from what he was talking about in many ways. We can argue about how much of what the causes of that are, and whether that's whether there was a alternative path or blah blah blah. But like, but it's asinine to say like, oh, saying Marx is a good economist is like saying that Nero was a good fiddler or Hitler was a good artist, I think was what he said. Which is like, completely bizarre on every possible level. I mean, for one thing, being an economist was central to what Marx did in a way that's a disanalogy there. For another thing, Marx never held state power. Like, it's just a bizarre conflation, that you have, that if you've got, that Marx, Marx didn't hold state power, so he certainly didn't commit any crimes. We can look at what he supported in his lifetime, which would be, the Paris Commune, ultra democratic. He had certain criticisms, but he was very enthusiastic about some of its most radically democratic aspects. The only head of state that that he even thought highly enough of to send him a nice telegram was Abraham Lincoln, who was democratically elected. So it's a really absurd thing to say, but also like, okay, if we are going to play that game, then like, sure, shouldn't we say like, depending on what your criteria of success is, I mean, like, I don't know. I mean, if I had to, if I had to live under a dictatorship in a third world country, and I'd rather not do either of those, but if I did, right, I'd certainly much rather have been born into Castro's Cuba than Batista's Cuba. I mean, no contest.
Yeah, and I want to make one last point about a kind of bigger picture issue, which is Hannan gets into the ubiquitous kind of conservative temptation to attribute virtually everything good thing that's emerged in rich countries over the past 2 centuries to capitalism. And you see this all around the place. I will bring the cat in a few seconds. So for instance, Jonah Goldberg in his book, Suicide of the West, has this very cheesy thing where he has a graph and it goes upwards and he says, this is life expectancy, cheers to capitalism. Right, it's all for that. And Hannan makes a very similar argument. The ironic thing being, first off, that Marx never denied this, and we pointed this out before, right? He was very, very emphatic about the way that capitalism was revolutionizing modes of production, creating wonders that the world had never seen. But what gets blocked out of this conservative narrative, probably in some instances deliberately, is the tremendous political agitation that had to go in to actually improving standards of life for many people in wealthy countries. Right, the UK being a spectacular example, and Marx was again very cognizant of the fact that workers' movements were demanding things like a shortening of the working day, imposing restrictions on things like child labor, creating things like the weekend, right, in order to give people the leisure time to actually live meaningful and fruitful lives with their families rather than just spending all of it at work. None of this is acknowledged in the kind of narratives that are put forward by these figures. And I think that this persists to the present day. So, for instance, a lot of conservative economists and politicians like to argue that, well, capitalism has brought tremendous wealth to developing countries, and it's the reason you don't see starvation at the same level anymore. But I think this is extremely wrong, and Marxism has pointed this out as well, that if you want to look at the actual reason why it is that famines don't take place on the scale that they have in the past, it's not because of capitalism, but because of the spread of democracy, which compels political actors to be accountable to the entirety of their citizenry. And many of them are, of course, not willing, consequently, to allow that citizenry to starve, because you're unlikely to get reelected in those kinds of instances, right?
Yeah, because the democracy as it actually exists is very imperfect, and and it's the extent to which political actors are limited by or even feel very much pressure to conform to their constituents' views is very limited in ways we're all aware of. But it's a pretty low bar, right? I mean, you don't have to be too worried about your constituents' opinion to not let them starve to death.
Yeah.
And even very incomplete forms of democracy seem to be very good at that. And also, again, if we're going to go back to to Karl Marx and Frederick Engels and what political formations most associated with, I mean, Frederick Engels was actually directly involved in the beginnings of the British Labour Party, which carried out obviously long after he died, and without papering over the considerable political differences between the kind of radical socialism that Engels advocated and what Clement Attlee's vision was. But the Attlee government carried out these massive sweeping reforms that did a lot to bring about those changes in life expectancy and the rest. Creating the NHS. Most obviously,
Jeremy Gilbert in his book 21st Century Socialism said that it's not a coincidence that the most popular institution in the United Kingdom for the past 80 years hasn't been the monarchy, certainly hasn't been the stock exchange. It's been the NHS, the most singularly visionary accomplishment of the Labour Party in the 20th century, right?
I just want to say, by the way, what you're saying about conservatives ignoring, and I see this it's such a common thing, right? Ignoring, the way that popular struggle is played into the improvement of living standard in developed countries, for example. I think one of the worst. We did a review of capitalism.
Not just on the economic issues either, and I want to point that out. If you think about the suffragette movement, the movement for racial inequality and civil rights, right? These never figure into this narrative, which makes it almost kind of laughably simplistic, right? It's just that graph again. It's capitalism has existed there this long. People's standards of living have continuously gone up. Obviously, correlation implies causation, so it must be entirely attributable to capitalism, right?
And I think one of the worst examples of this, actually, we did this review of Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman, and I find it absolutely hilarious at one point, because he starts bragging about the level of economic equality that exists in Sweden as being symptomatic of the benefits of the unfettered free market, versus, and then he even remarks that. I think he says, well, we don't, this is sort of bizarre passage. He says, well, we don't really have economic data that's reliable in Soviet Russia. He says, but, it's possible that capitalism has even created a more equanimous system in Sweden than in the Soviet Union. Should we have the data and compare it? Right? It's just what the fuck are you talking about? As respect to what you were saying, Ben, about, this idea that, which is common in sort of neoliberal or conservative circles, that socialist states have all failed. Aegis Ahmad makes this point. Yeah, it's true that when compared with the most sort of utopic pronunciations of Marx, I suppose you could conclude that all socialist states have failed. But if you come back down to fucking earth, and this is what Ahmad points out, if you make a fair comparison, right? If you compare Cuba to, the Dominican Republic, if you compare China to India, what you'll see is that socialist countries, in the third world in particular, have consistently outperformed in many respects their capitalist peers, right? So we always have this thing, right? We compare, we'll take Cuba and we'll compare it to something, completely asymmetrical, like, Florida, right? It's not an appropriate basis of comparison. I mean, if you look at the Soviet Union, it's like the Russian economy in 1917 was 15% of the U.S. economy. That was their starting point, right? So if, even 3 decades later, you're taking, 4 decades later, you're taking Moscow and comparing it to New York, well, it is the case that the strides made in that time were amazing, but you could never expect that it would have reached that point anyway, right? Under any sort of system.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's, I think what you can say in many of these cases is that they were very good at doing a sort of initial phase of rapid industrialization and development, and that oftentimes these economies stalled out after that. And I think that and I think that some of that, is I think some of that is just because there really are the one thing that some of the bourgeois economists we've been correctly dunking on, we're not entirely wrong about is that like markets do enable you to coordinate production with fine-grained consumer demands in a way that's much harder to replicate in completely non-market ways. And I think that and I think that like a lot of people on the left, socialist left, have like learned all these sort of glib ways of dismissing the problem. That they'll say, well, I mean, Lee Phillips, one of the co-authors of People's Republic of Walmart, is a friend of mine, but like I think a lot of people did not read that book closely enough because they'll say, oh, look, Walmart has this giant internal economy and its plan, therefore, we've figured it all out, right? Like modern technology has just made this a non-problem. But if you actually read that book, I mean, he kind of says, he and his co-author Mikhail Rusworski say at the end, it's there are certain strides that have been made, but we probably do still need some markets right now. Maybe we can like take more and more things out of the market as as technology gets better. So I mean, I think that both are true, right? I mean, like I guess I'd want to do some Clinton-esque triangulation, have both ways here. That on the one hand,
depends on what your definition of is, what your definition of market is.
Yeah, exactly.
Endless like ontological obfuscation.
Exactly.
But just to say, can I just want to say, Ben,
please,
in the third world, which is mostly where socialist governments have sort of prevailed, where there has been successful revolutions, for example. Very few countries have ever reached sort of the very few countries, capitalist or socialist, from the colonized world, have reached the point where they've had to negotiate that difficulty, right? Because a lot of them haven't got beyond the point of industrialization. So I think that did become a problem. In the Eastern Bloc, in the Soviet Union, at the point where it had succeeded industrially, and where it was eyeing, ascension to the same level in terms of material living standards as what had been achieved, in Western Europe, for example, or in the United States. We see it now being China's obviously eyeing, that sort of leap forward, right? That they're using a more market-driven means of attempting to realize it, right? But I mean, in a lot of these places, like Cuba, for example, it's not as if their capitalist peers have reached this level where they've transcended industrial production and developed this robust service economy. In which context, just having very, very strong social programming and so forth already seems like an immense accomplishment.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, I think that I was just going to say, I mean, I think that in the case. I mean, I think it's kind of ironic that this kind of authoritarian state socialism was very good at not the thing that Marx thought the socialism was for, but the thing that Marx thought that capitalism was for, right? That like, very like maybe simplistically and schematically. I mean, like Marx thought that, that the sort of historical mission of capitalism was to, develop the world, build up the industrial machine that created the conditions for a more egalitarian world that wasn't just like more equally distributing crumbs, right? But then you could have once that had been created, then socialism can come in and take over that machine and use it in a more humane way and distribute the democratically control the distribution of the surplus and all that stuff. So I think that most of these societies haven't, again, I think that their real accomplishments are in the thing that Marx thought of as the mission of capitalism. But I guess I think that the extent to which so the Clinton-esque triangulation, I think that like the extent to which the sort of traditional anti-Stalinist left is right is that democracy in the classical Marxist conception isn't just some like nice optional add-on, it's cool if you can get it. It's the heart of the beast. It's the whole point. And I think that's absolutely right. And of course, that's dramatically lacking in most of these societies we're talking about. And that is a really crucial distinction. But the place where I maybe think that the sort of conventional anti-Stalinist left is less convincing, here maybe I agree with you, maybe agree with Slavoj, maybe, is that I think that it's very easy and kind of cheap to contrast, to say, this was bad because it's not, because it differs from this like incredibly vague thing that exists in my mind, right? I mean, that's not that like, okay, right? Like say, yeah, I mean, in my extremely non-detailed imagination, like we have it all, right? We have democracy, we have egalitarian outcomes, we don't have calculation problems, and this isn't, we have, from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs, and so I'm going to judge this real society because it fails to live up to that. I mean, that's not very interesting, right? I think that, so I think that the real question is like, okay, we know what the failings and horrors are of capitalism. We know what the failings and horrors are of the sort of authoritarian state socialism, or whatever you want to call it. I'm not too invested in the semantic issue of like the Soviet bloc countries in the 20th century. The real challenge is, are those realistically the only options, or can we do better than either one of them? And if we can do better, we shouldn't just sort of state our values, right? Like we should try to explain in detail how that better would actually look, and how it would work in practice, and all of that stuff. I think if we want like well-informed people to take us seriously, so that's the extent to which I'm a little critical of the conventional anti-Stalinist left. I mean, Alec Nove makes that point in his book, The Economics of Feasible Socialism, and and I've got some, I've got some thoughts about what that like more like logistically well worked out, like viable, fully democratic socialist society could look like. But I think that the version of that critique that you've gotten from a lot of anti-Stalinist Marxists in the 20th century has been a little vague and a little lazy. Real quick, RBU 83145 says, thank you for the super chat. Says, seems to me that Hannan overlooks how the capitalist system through the IMF and World Bank has suppressed economic development in many countries, for example, forcing the privatization of resources. Yeah, I mean, that just seems clearly true. All right, let's do all right. Let's watch. We're going to try to cut it off. We are going to have to do a part 3. We've got. I'm not sure if there's a point where there's Q&A or anything. I kind of think no, because it's in Zoom. But sometimes we Stalinistically cut off before the Q&A. But I think that I think we've got like good 43 minutes left in the debate, and we were going to cut out at like 10 Eastern, so there will be a part 3. But let's watch just a few more minutes of the debate right now.
Can I very briefly, because now I claim we come as it were, we come to the real thing. When you mentioned Matt Ridley and all that stuff, yes, I agree with many of his claims. My point is just, maybe you will accuse me here of a Marxist remainder or what. My point is just that, all countries cannot become rich in this way. I know all the data that even Africa is progressing now, and so on and so on. I don't believe that the wealth that we saw in the so-called Western developed countries can be universalized. Don't forget also, I know this is the standard leftist point, it's often exaggerated, but nonetheless that rich and poor countries are part of the same world. So you cannot simply say, why do they not all become the way we are? I think that the world exchange system, the way we practice it now, here I remain an old-fashioned leftist, is also not only getting the richer rich, but also making poor countries also ecologically devastated. Like the classical example that I know well is, for example, Ecuador, where again natural resources are ruined and so on and so on. So I nonetheless think that the things we are confronting today.
Anybody going to take a shot at that?
Points about reforestation and so on. People.
Sorry, did you want to say something, Matt?
Oh no, it's just the Žižek drinking game, right? He did the and so on thing. So I feel like somebody should take a shot, but
fair enough.
That are not aware that there are now, at this moment, there are more forests in the world than I think at any point in the last 100 years, if I read correctly some data. But nonetheless, again, we cannot go into details now. I think that some kind of cooperation will be absolutely necessary, stronger cooperation, collaboration, or whatever you call it, that without that we are lost. Because, you know, friends are telling me, you see, now, just for my leftist argument, I'm not dreaming about crazy revolutionary measures. I'm saying, look at what now, for example, Biden is doing. Are we aware that these are measures which, economic measures and so on, which if somebody were to propose them 2 years ago, he would be dismissed as crazy socialist and so on and so on. So, you know, what interests me today is not some crazy lunatic fringe left doing this, but how the system itself makes it clear that precisely in order to have a well-functioning society, you need more cooperation. So I want to ask you, sorry, I did come to my question. Sorry, you are my super ego, Joel. Another question here, my final one. How do you look upon this idea, even of some right-wing liberals, of some leftists and so on, that we are entering a new phase of capitalism with this extraordinary role of big, ultra-rich corporations, and that this no longer fits the logic of classical capitalism, but it some even, I wouldn't go as far, risk the term neo-feudalism, that it's such strong wealth, totally out of touch of any meaningful local control and so on, and so on. All this linked with incredible measures, incredible level of our control. So a double question, I'm sorry. A, where do you stand with regard of these new corporations, these mega corporations are something new, controlling us in unheard of ways, disconnected with all the data collecting, which I think pandemic has nothing to do this.
Thank you.
I know at least three.
Can we turn it over to Daniel?
Just the last one.
Thank you.
Well, how do you stand there with regard to Julian Assange here? He's my hero. Stop. I'm sorry.
Nice.
Let me try and deal with some of those in order. First of all, let's stay in the Andes. We've discussed Bolivia. We've discussed Ecuador. I was brought up in Lima, and I think it demonstrates a fundamental problem that defenders of markets have, which is that there is an aesthetic objection. That's the only way I can put it, an aesthetic objection to development. The Victorian novelist Anthony Trollope once said, poverty to be scenic should be rural, right? And this is a trope very much developed by your friend Engels, right? The idea that there is something fundamentally ugly about industrialization. When I was a kid in Lima, the town was surrounded by these shanty towns, these slums on all the surrounding hills, you know, barriadas, they were called, barriadas. And we would have friends who come and stay from the UK or Europe or the US, and they do the usual tourist thing in Peru. They go to Cusco and Machu Picchu, they do the Inca Trail. They come and almost every time, almost every time, you would get the same question. Why? Why are people leaving these scenic Andean villages and coming down to the barriadas to live among the traffic fumes and the open sewers, right? Slavoj, it was a very first world question. No Peruvian ever needed to ask why you would leave a village where there's no running water, no electricity, no job, no school, no clinic, right? What was obvious to the people in the barriadas, but is not always obvious to the aesthetic critics in the West, is that they were a transitional phase. Transitional for the people who were moving on to something else. They were busily engaged in industry and commerce. They were selling cigarettes at traffic lights, recycling, sorting through garbage to resell it and so on. And also transitional for the districts, which improved and got richer with time. Now, our country went through this first. We pioneered it, which is why it's left a scar, which is why even now people have this bizarre idea of the Industrial Revolution in England as scripted by Engels, rather than the reality, which is that it lengthened life expectancy, increased literacy, gave opportunities to people. Yours went through it later. Peru has gone through it more recently still, and now the last few bits of the world are experiencing the same process. But the end of that transformation is always to give people longer, freer, happier lives than they had when they were breaking their backs, working dawn to dusk in fields. So I think that there's a really important point that we shouldn't miss the good stories here. In terms of Julian Assange, he is it's a question for the court. If he's guilty, he should serve his sentence. If he's not, he's not. I don't think that his guilt or innocence is remotely dependent on his opinions or my opinions or anyone else's opinions. I believe in the rule of law. But I'll just finish by saying I think that if we can only open our eyes to the extraordinary transformations that are going on, there's so much gloom. This idea that constant idea that capitalism is in crisis, is in its death throes, that something new is bound to emerge. I was born in 1971. The year that I was born, it took the average worker in this country 3 months to be able to afford a television set. Now it's 2 days. Right? The year that I was born, fewer than half of girls got anything beyond primary education in the world. Now it's more than 90%. The year that I was born, a stationary car emitted more pollution than a car moving at full speed today. Things get better because human ingenuity is an extraordinarily powerful force, provided that people are allowed and incentivized to invest and to, if you like, to profit from their own offering of a service to the people around them. And
it's kind of neat that he's attributing the benefits of women's education to capitalism and not the feminist movement, the suffragette movement, not to mention, state actors who actually try to provide public education to girls, often against the objections of people who claim that they'd be better off working in factories.
Yeah, I mean, not to mention, certainly, I think the evidence is overwhelming that that more equality, the best way to advance gender equality is more egalitarian economic policies. I mean, I think that if you look at we were talking earlier about the track record of Stalinism, which is in many ways hideous, but it was way better than what came before on issues of gender equality, and certainly, social democracy has been great for that. I mean, that. So in many ways, right? The fact that more people in general are able to go to college, the fact that women specifically, have this ability in greater numbers, in many ways is due to limitations on the market by the state, not just by the invisible hand doing its thing. That's what do you say? The last few parts of the world, this transitional phase is playing out, which, just in terms of sheer numbers, is a crazy way to put it, right? To refer to the developing world as if this were just some mop-up operation. It's here are the last few places that that haven't achieved first world living standards yet. That's just obviously. That's just obviously absurd. I mean, we're talking about the majority of the world is in that category. And, you know, what he's talking about with Engels, you know, I mean, I assume he's talking about Engels's book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, which is not anti-industrialization for fuck's sake. I mean, that's it's about the way, you know, the sort of extreme poverty and misery that existed, you know, among workers there. But it's not like Engels was like one of those dipshit tourists who's like pining, you know, for like the simple, you know, way of life of the Andean villages. You know, I mean, Engels was already a socialist, you know, when he wrote that. You know, like he didn't want to go back. You know, he wanted to go forward.
Yeah, and actually, I think this is something that's actually really important, and I'm just going to end with this. There are aesthetic critics of capitalism that existed for a long time, and typically they come from the political right, not the political left, which is the really unusual thing about it. People like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Thomas Carlyle, who I mentioned before, T.S. Eliot, even Roger Scruton, oddly enough, in some moments, would make claims like this in the meaning of conservatism. And typically the argument is actually very much in a Marxian line, right? Which is that capitalism disrupts traditionalist forms of communities, it breaks down rural living and compels people towards things like urbanization. And most problematically, it breaks down traditional aristocratic and religious hierarchies and replaces them with a much more dynamic kind of hierarchy, which is what you see in a market society. And old-fashioned conservatives don't like that, right? Because they think the hierarchy should be much more static, right? Or should be based on a different kind of value system than the value system of the market. Interestingly enough, Nietzsche made a similar criticism, right? So it's really odd that he's making this claim, since I don't know virtually any major socialist or leftist thinker who's made a kind of aesthetic criticism of capitalism, except in certain moments for a kind of rhetorical flourish, right? The argument that's typically made, if you make it from a moral point of view, isn't that industrialization is ugly. It's that a society where the wealth exists to actually ameliorate human problems, but it isn't used for that because instead it's concentrated in the hands of a few who use it for things like conspicuous consumption of what happens to be, is an unjust world. Because there are people who are suffering, we could help them, and yet we don't do so because the so-called logic of the market doesn't allow it, right? And you know, there are all kinds of different flavors and iterations of this argument, and we could talk about them. But this moral objection, to me, is vastly stronger and more compelling than some kind of aesthetic objection launched by someone like T.S. Eliot, who's complaining about the fact that factories are ugly and people don't happen to read enough William Blake any longer, which is, you know, the worst thing in the entire world, right?
He does know that Engels actually ran like a textile factory, right? And that's like he also furnished Marx with like the funds to like write his stuff through that. So it seems like kind of a weird thing to claim that he's, you know, simply vehemently anti-industry. There's a consistent fallacy that emerges in Hanan's discussion, which seems to be that, again, as you put it, Ben, that you know, the prevalence of industry, it's just kind of a mop-up operation in the third world. Eventually, everyone's going to reach a point where you know, they're all living as if it's the first world, provided we liberalize markets enough. And again, you know, very, very blatantly ignoring, you know, the preconditions for wealth in the first world, which, you know, are also is also the expansion of industrial production abroad. You know, when he sort of cherry picks and talks about, you know, how much things have purportedly improved in the United Kingdom. I mean, in the first world, we can see that, you know, over the past few decades, in many respects, things have regressed for the masses at large. In the United States, I believe the average lifespan has declined now for several years on end. Home ownership has went down since 2007-08. But when he says something like, well, today, you know, a worker can purchase a television, you know, in 3 days. I mean, let's be clear about why this is. It's because of, you know, the expansion of these sort of oppressive industrial conditions, you know, in places like China, right, that have facilitated that. And when, you know, but of course, when he also points out that, you know, and it's true of China, for example, that, you know, workers, you know, in these countries, people in these countries clearly see the benefit of living in an urban area and working in an industrial context rather than, you know, continuing to reside in the countryside. This actually just sort of conforms to, you know, the point that Marx makes throughout Capital, right? That this isn't a choice, right? That it's not like you just sort of voluntarily subscribe to an employer based on your preference, right? You know, that there are, you know, you had, Marx talks about how I think much of Ireland, right, was converted into land for sort of sheep grazing, right? You know, and the people there, you know, there was no means of continuing to survive. They're kind of shipped to England to perform industrial tasks, right? This is not, you know, something which is consensual, right? It's compulsory. So I think that's important to remark. About what you said, Matt, about the the relationship between sort of or you were ascribing this sort of aesthetic critique of industrialization to conservative thinkers. I would agree with you from a historical standpoint, though I would note, and I think the Accelerationist Manifesto, by Cernicek and Williams is correct about this, that, in the sort of aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union and kind of the decline of political Marxism in the West and abroad, I think there was a tendency for, the left, in the West, for instance, to begin more and more to apply what they describe as a kind of folk politics, or to use this sort of right. So I think that would be, I think when he says that, that would be, if we're going to say that there's anything to it, right, it would be kind of the hollowing out, I think, of the more complex economic systematization of Marx in favor of this, sort of simplistic back to nature, or, you see it in certain anarchist circles kind of perspective that was common in that period.
Yeah, Žižek has a really good critique of exactly this kind of viewpoint that hopefully we'll be able to talk about next time when we do part 3.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, the fact that Hannan thinks that Engels is anti-industrialization is just bizarre. It's particularly bizarre that he wants to both equate Marx and Engels with Stalin, right, and just ignore the numerous and profound differences, ideologically there, despite, and he wants, what's convenient to his argument, he wants to point out the terrible environmental track record of industrialization in Comecon countries, but at the same time, he wants to say that Engels' expose of the misery of working class people in England was somehow anti-industrialization, or that Engels' views were somehow similar to annoying hippie tourists who glorify the simple way of life and in Andean villages. I mean, this but which is it, right? It seems like you'd have to pick between those critiques. You can't really run both of them. I also find it kind of hilarious that he's going to, again, correctly talk about the real horrors that exist in societies like Stalin's Russia, but at the same time, his big defense of sweatshops in the developing world is this is just transitional, which I mean there's a would also that would also be Stalin's defense of a lot of what he did. Look, this is just transitional. This is something we have to go through, so we can have we could have the flowering of red plenty later on. It's in the future. It's such a weird it's such a weird cheap dishonest out, right? Just to say markets, even if it's true, right? I mean, you could make in classical Marxist terms, there's a case you can make for this, that maybe you do have to go through some capitalist misery to get out to build up the industrial base to create the possibility for something better later. Even if that was true, which I think it's more complicated, but even if it is entirely true, that still wouldn't be relevant to certainly to Slavoj's critique in this debate, right? It wouldn't be relevant to claims about unregulated markets. And it certainly wouldn't be relevant to the point that, again, all of these nice things that he's playing up that happen in developed countries have happened to a great extent because of state intervention to stop markets from just doing their thing. I mean, if we didn't have even the mild and stunted and distorted form of social democracy that we got in the U.S. through the New Deal and the Great Society, which was, a pale shadow of what existed in some European countries, that had labor or socialist parties instead of having to, go through, the Democrats. But even there, I mean, it achieved a lot of things that have increased life expectancy, et cetera, against the will of the free market. I mean, if we left it up to the free market, we probably still wouldn't have electrification in the hill country of Texas. If there hadn't been the Tennessee Valley Authority to have, massive state intervention, when that wasn't really worthwhile for that number of customers, for those companies. Never mind everything that's happened as a result of, everything else that Matt mentioned, the suffragettes and the civil rights movement and the labor movement, and all of these things that are not just like the free market playing out. These are things that oftentimes are bringing about state policy to force, to force private actors to do things that they would never do on their own, like, end racial discrimination, provide electricity to the Texas Hill Country, stop sexually harassing female employees, et cetera, all of which, are statist impositions on the free market. I mean, like, he could at least be an honest libertarian and say he's against all those things, or he could be like, an honest reformist and say, okay, maybe you do have to do this, but just sort of dodging the issue by saying that markets create industrial development that's a precondition for nice things is, even to the extent that it might be true, is just a silly evasion of the issue. El Macho Shrigma, thank you for the super chat. Did the Belgian priest discover the Big Bang happen regardless of his Catholicism or because of it? I'm not arguing for people to be religious. I'm questioning whether unreasonable beliefs allow creative door to open. I do not know a lot about this part of the philosophy, the history of physics. Maybe you guys do. Although also, even if you do, I think rolling in the deep about the epistemology of physics might not be good right now because we are 6 minutes over when we were going to cut out. So. I don't know. Think about that. If either of you have anything insightful to say about the relationship between religion and the history of physics, we can start with that next time. But meanwhile, thank you guys. I'll see you next Sunday for part 3.
Thanks so much.